Well, there is now a lot of talk in the government about whether or not there will now be a trade deal with India. And remember, remember, this was sold by the Brexiteers and Boris Johnson in particular, that this would become one of the jewels in the crown of the post-Brexit era of trade deals, that we would have all these fantastic new trade deals, but the new magnum opus would be the one from India. Now, of course, if you may remember, back in the time when Johnson declared this, the Indian, I believe, trade minister at the time said that India would not become the new post-Brexit imperial bazaar for the UK. And really, since then, both Truss and Johnson have tried desperately to try and woo India into try and getting a trade deal of some form or another. But such a trade deal, as we've talked about before, will come with a lot of downsides for the UK, many of which, especially UK manufacturers, are not prepared for. And we'll get into some of those in a moment. But oh boy, yeah, if what is one of the things that India are pushing for, yeah, UK manufacturers are not going to be happy with that. And not only that, but of course, one of the big things that India wants is it wants more visas. And of course, the Brexiteers don't want to have, shall we say, switching from EU immigration now over to Indian immigration. It's not, shall we say, a great grand plan that they sold to their Brexit, their whole, Brexit plan that, we were fine. We just cut off all those, EU workers, and guess what? Everyone gets a job. You get a job. You get a job. You get a job. And of course, that's not how it works. And as we've said many times before, it's not like the Brexiteers actually really understand what indeed they were signing up for, as we saw recently when Nadine Dorries had to ask about the single market. But of course, the entire form of trade and even sort of the UK economy itself. So, before we go diving into some of this stuff that has been put forward in this potential trade deal and why it is reaching such a very obvious sticking point at the moment, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel that way. And there's also the YouTube thank you button and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So, the first and most obvious one, why this is becoming a very much, shall we say, stuck in the mud at the moment, and especially talks around this trade deal, is the fact that next year there is going to be a general election, both for Sunak and for Modi as well. So doing a trade deal at the moment, well, it's not the top of their agenda, especially for someone like Sunak, who probably is not going to win his next general election. Modi, on the other hand, probably will. And then after, he will be, shall we say, much more keen to talk, probably with, well, whoever else is there at the moment. But with Labour saying that, hey, the EU is actually a pretty important trading partner, we can't just disregard them. Maybe, shall we say, the priority for a Labour government to get an Indian trade deal would also not be that high on the agenda either. The other one, of course, comes back to, as we just briefly talked about, the Brexiteers. They are desperate to try and show that global Britain is a thing. That this was one of the reasons why people voted for Brexit, although arguably probably not. When you question a lot of Brexiteers, they wanted less globalism, not more globalism. But They are desperate to try and say that this whole works. That look, we're doing all this trade with India, and it's a developing economy, isn't it? Isn't it good? We're trading with a developing economy, as we've said before. Just because you are quote trading with a developing economy does not mean that your economy develops with it or that you gain the benefits of that GDP growth. Because, of course, as we said before, the Brexiteers are obsessed with growth because they're free market fundamentalists and they don't really understand um, anything else besides, number go up, it means good. If number stays the same for too long, well, ooh, that's all very bad. That's their general, should we say, take on economies. And they are not going to be too enthused because, as we also said, India wants more visas. And especially, that is not going to fly well with the Brexiteers who sold Brexit as we are going to end all this EU migration and then we're going to actually accept all this immigration from India. It's not going to sell well for them. Even when you take into the fact that immigration from India has actually gone up 81%. And yet they're still worried about the small boats. Like I say, um, they panic all the time at anything that might make them look good. And in reality, immigration is really a complex thing. It doesn't have any really easy sort of solutions to it, except of the small boats one we've said many times. Fund the system, create safe routes. You would end the small boat crossings overnight. It just makes the government look good and or competent and or being tough on immigration. So it would not make, shall we say, the government look good, or at least the Brexiteers look good, when they're, shall we say, just changing from an EU workforce over to an Indian one. But the other one that I would have big problems with is that India wants more student visas so that they can send students over to the UK, get their training at our universities, and then come back to India. Now, I have a big problem with that. First of all, because I am fully of the belief that if you come here to study, then as far as I'm concerned, if you get a degree here, you have every right to apply to stay in this country. We want you to stay in this country. If you have come and you have got a degree at whichever university in the UK you may have obtained it from, then you should have the right to sort of stay in this country. We want you to use your degree here because that is good for the economy. That is good for the long-term health of our economy. It is a good thing. But the way that India wants to set this up is it is essentially, well, you could go to one of our, universities in India, or you could go on this route where you could just go to the university in the UK and then, you come back to India. That's not something we want to do because really any of those, future potential UK citizens, as we would like to call them, who would come here, get their university degree, we want them to put it to work here because that will be good for our economy. Allowing them to do that to essentially have a conveyor belt where they're put on from India, they go through the conveyor belt, get the degree, and then it drops them back off for India is bad for our economy and only benefits India. We want them to stay. But of course, the Brexiteers would not be in favor of any kind of program like that at all. So, but that's part of the, shall we say, one of the many sticking plasters when it comes to it. Of course, the other big one, and then we talked about this before about UK manufacturing being up in arms, is that India wants to insist that any UK product, any UK manufactured good is made wholly and sourced from this trade deal or in the UK. Meaning, if you are a UK company and you maybe say import stuff from Europe or America, You can't take part in this trade deal. You can't then send that product that you made over to India. Sorry, you can't take part in that. And they are very, very keen to push this because we are not a manufacturing uh, country as we once were. Most of everything that we make comes from everywhere else, is assembled here in the UK and then goes on to a final destination somewhere else. At that point, India is essentially saying, unless you are prepared to accept everything from us or accept like 100% of the manufacturing parts from us and then sell it back to us, it's not very once again good economically for the UK. And once again, so much for global Britain at that point, right? And there are many, many things that India are, of course, insisting when it comes to uh, these things as well. They are, of course, insisting on a lot of, shall we say, removal of tariffs, which would again mean a lot of flood of cheap goods into the UK, which would again affect negatively our domestic producers on the domestic market. Once again, ultimately, just because you get cheap imports does not mean that is a quote good, successful trade deal. Because what then happens to your domestic market? What then happens to your domestic producers, your domestic manufacturing market? So, the final one, of course, is questions are now starting to be asked about, well, some of this stuff that Rishi Sunak might be signing up to might actually benefit him because one of the big beneficiaries of this trade deal would be Infos, one of which his family wealth is heavily tied to. And Downing Street knows this. It has brought this up as a big optics position that the Prime Minister has signed this trade deal to one of which he benefits greatly. It's not very good. Even one person who's familiar with this in Downing Street, let me just get the quote because I think this is good. Basically, saying this: Number 10 has had to worry on this issue for some time, but said that there was a lot of sources aware of thinking this way on the government on this particular issue, saying that there's a lot of concern about perception, what it looks like to people, and of course a worry that one day someone will join the dots. So they know full well that all these trade deals we're signing at the moment are going to be negatively affecting the UK in quite some bad ways. Of course, the Australian trade deal is with the farmers, but this one in particular will heavily, if it got signed, shall we say, in what India has been asking for, as we explained, it would heavily negatively affect not only just farmers again, the whole manufacturing industry here in the UK. Needless to say, so far, this trade deal is not good. And I want to remind you, India technically is what, the fifth, sixth biggest economy, I think, with something roundabout the same level. But ultimately, once again, as we've always said, these trade deals will have negative effects on the economy. It's just the Brexiteers are obsessed with this idea that if you have cheap imports coming in, then everything's fine. But that's not necessarily the case, as we've explained a number of times. But of course, we'll have to see what happens. But at the moment, I'm not expecting anything. I'm not expecting anything. There's talk, of course, a quick harvest deal potentially in the works, but then that also might not be a good thing as well, because Australia did something very similar with their talks in India, hoping that it might lead to a more greater in-depth one. But of course, that hasn't happened for Australia either. We'll see. we'll see what happens. But of course, yeah, these trade deals so far, once again, proving not, shall we say, very beneficial to the UK. So, as always, thank you very much, as always, and we'll see you all next time.